Good morning, everyone. It's still morning. I'm Damien Morris. Today, I'm going to be talking to you about free will, human agency, and personal responsibility, and discussing how these philosophical questions bear on behavioral genetic research and vice versa. So this talk is based on a series that's been published in Twin Research in Human Genetics, so please check that out. And you might already be asking yourselves, what has all of this got to do with me? I'm an empirical scientist. I'm concerned with answering empirical questions, not these abstract philosophical questions. Well, it turns out it has quite a lot to do with us. As Keynes famously noted, the ideas of philosophers, both when they are right and when they are wrong, are more powerful than is commonly understood. And practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influences are usually the slaves of some defunct philosopher. So today I'm going to be talking to you about a confused theory of free will that lurks in the background, not just of behavioral genetics, but large swathes of the social sciences in general. And I'll be talking about how it can negatively impact empirical research in behavioral genetics by prejudicing us against genetic explanations for human behavior. So this theory drives a culture of recrimination in which accusations of genetic determinism are regularly hurled at, and sometimes by behavioral geneticists. It also fosters a climate which makes it difficult to conduct genetic research on socially significant traits by motivating key gatekeepers to place additional barriers in the way of such research. So the philosopher Daniel Dennett has a wonderfully evocative quote which captures the key characteristics of this theory. He writes, "There is no more potent source of anxiety about free will than the image of the physical sciences engulfing our every deed, good and bad, in the acid broth of causal explanation, nibbling away at the soul until there is nothing left to praise or blame, to honor, respect, or love." Now, I love this phrase, the acid broth of causal explanation, because it captures the widespread anxiety that to the extent that science shows our behavior is caused by something outside of ourselves, we cannot be held responsible for it. It also conveys how the threats to agency posed by the behavioral sciences are conceived negatively, nibbling away at the soul until there is nothing left. So Dennett's quote thereby captures the central features of a theory of free will by subtraction that is pervasive across the behavioral sciences. A theory suggests the domain of human agency is whatever's left over after the measured causes of behavioral variation have been accounted for. So once you become sensitized to this theory of free will, this free will by subtraction, you begin to see it everywhere. It's implicit in the logic displayed across the social sciences that individuals are victims of circumstance to the extent that their outcomes can be statistically predicted by variables like their parents' income or educational attainment. It's also pervasive in broader moral and political debates, where individuals are often regarded as less responsible for their socioeconomic outcomes, health outcomes, or even the crimes they've committed based on their childhood circumstances. But the conspicuous feature of this theory of free will by subtraction is that beyond the social determinants of various life outcomes, individuals are assumed to remain responsible agents with power over their own life choices. These statistical intrusions on human agency are treated as limited exceptions to the general rule of human autonomy. But what's typically left unexplained is how human agency is supposed to arise under a secular materialist framework in which all human behavior is assumed to ultimately have antecedent causes, or why scientific knowledge of those causes should infringe upon our freedom more than causes that have not been identified. So increasingly in social science genetics, this same logic is being extended to genetic influences on behavior. For example, in this paper, Rita Pereira explores how both childhood socioeconomic circumstances and genetic differences in ability can both be used as statistical measures of unfair sources of inequality. And for statistical analysis, use the EA3 polygenic score from Leah et al. 2018, but she acknowledges that this might underestimate the total genetic contribution to educational inequalities. Meanwhile, in this study by Gretz et al., comparing sibling correlations for educational attainment across different countries, the authors defend this obviously genetically confounded measure of unequal opportunity by suggesting that the genetic advantages that siblings hold in common are another source of undeserved inequality. In fact, they note by failing to capture the genetic advantages that make siblings different from each other, they are actually underestimating the full effects of family background on inequality. So what these two studies have in common is the idea that there are unfair sources of inequality that are due to antecedent genetic and environmental conditions, as opposed to fair sources of inequality that aren't due to antecedent causes, but are instead a result of the agent's own actions. Now, that second clause should give you a moment's pause. In any case, the conclusion that both studies seem to be fumbling towards is that the correlation between monozygotic twins is the best measure of unequal opportunity, because it's an omnibus measure of both the total genetic effects on a trait and the total effects of the family environment. In other words, the conclusion they seem to be reaching for is that the non-shared environmental variance is all that people can be held accountable for. Let me just move that across there. Work. Now, if that idea seems familiar to you, that's because it was fully worked out by Eric Turkheimer, who has perhaps developed the most explicit presentation of the free will by subtraction theory. Is Eric in here today? Yes, hello. Great. His clearest formulation of this theory was given in his 2011 comment piece, Genetics and Human Agency, and the theory was recently recapitulated by Paige Harden, who's here as well, in her 2021 book, The Genetic Lottery. So Turkheimer's theory stands behind Harden's point that your genotype, like the social class of your family, is an accident at birth over which you had no control and a source of luck in your life. In that 2011 paper, Turkheimer explicitly declares that the non-shared environment is free will. And he argues that we can claim this because the non-shared environment quantifies human agency as the variation in a given trait that remains after genetic effects and the effects of the family environment have been taken into account. Turkheimer has another theory of free will, which I call the gloomy prospect theory of free will, which I won't have time to go into today, but it has a similar underlying logic. Turkheimer even goes on to argue that we can rank different behavioral traits according to their controllability and moral relevance, using their non-shared environmental variance as a measuring stick. Weight more than height, personality more than intelligence, depression more than schizophrenia. Now, he doesn't put it in writing, but this table clearly invites readers to reach the conclusion that we have more agency over our sexual orientation than whether we commit a crime. Now, I have a think to yourself, does that sound right? It doesn't sound right to me. It may be true that the non-shared environmental variance for sexual orientation is relatively large, but it doesn't mean I can control my sexual orientation or change the kind of people that I'm sexually attracted to. So it seems that something might be a little awry in how we're conceiving the non-shared environment here. So let's dig a little bit deeper. Why does Turkheimer say that the non-shared environment can measure human agency and the controllability of different traits? On the basis that we haven't identified the specific causes of non-shared environmental differences between siblings. He references a review that he conducted with Mary Waldron, which found that the measured non-shared environmental variables collectively explained less than 3% of the variation in behavioral traits on average. So the fundamental logic here is that human beings can't be held responsible for their behavior when we can isolate the specific antecedent causes of their behavior. But of course, just because we haven't isolated the specific causes of someone's behavior doesn't mean that behavior wasn't caused. Let's recall how Plowman and Daniels first described the gloomy prospect that we might never isolate the specific sources of the non-shared environmental variance. They write that the relevant environmental factors might be unsystematic, idiosyncratic, or serendipitous events. This is to say that the non-shared environment might consist of trillions of sliding doors moments, such as catching or missing a particular train, or looking left versus looking right, each of which drives our lives in subtly or dramatically different directions from those of our siblings, if we have any. So, contrary to both Turkheimer and Harden, it's not just genetic and shared environmental influences which are a source of luck in our lives. Most of what we would ordinarily call dumb luck consists of non-shared environmental influences. Moreover, as Harden herself notes in an important footnote to the genetic lottery, the non-shared environment might substantially consist of random developmental differences between monozygotic twins, which they can hardly be held responsible for. This leads her to conclude that there is hardly any behavioral variation that isn't explained by antecedent causes, leaving remarkably little territory left for personal responsibility. But note that she fails to bite the bullet and say there is no territory left for personal responsibility. So, what is this mysterious leftover sliver of the non-shared environmental variance where human agency is supposed to reside? Are we supposed to believe there is some fraction of human behavioral variation that isn't ultimately explained by antecedent secular causes? I hope you're beginning to see the problem here. The philosophical mistake that's being made has been given several names, but the philosopher and legal scholar Stephen Morse famously calls it the fundamental psycho-legal error. He explains it thus. Most of the time, we possess only imperfect, partial understanding of the causes of behavior. It's important to remember, however, that not possessing knowledge of the complete causal account of a person's behavior does not mean that a complete causal account does not exist. This is a universally caused or deterministic universe. All phenomena are caused, whether or not we have knowledge of those causes. He continues, in a causally deterministic universe, all phenomena, including human actions, are fully caused. If causation were per se an excusing condition, no one could ever be responsible for anything. Thus, causation cannot be an excusing condition in law and morals, both of which hold some people responsible and excuse others. So, in the academic discourse on free will, it's understood that you basically have two main options open to you. Either you believe that the comprehensive causation of behavior is compatible with free will and that personal responsibility exists, or you believe that the antecedent causation of behavior is incompatible with free will and that personal responsibility does not exist. The first category are called compatibilists, and the second category are called incompatibilists. There is a third option, which argues that human behavior is only partially due to antecedent natural causes, which is called libertarian incompatibilism. But that's essentially a supernatural and dualistic view of human agency, which posits that human beings have an immaterial soul, and that every time we make a decision, a miracle occurs that allows us to break from the laws of causation that govern the material world. But it should go without saying that making allowances for supernatural agent causation is a pretty unusual way to go about the secular enterprise of conducting behavioral science. Interestingly, Turkheimer's idea that the scientifically unexplained variation in behavior is a yardstick of human agency perfectly maps on to this supernatural theory of free will, because it would suggest that the reason we haven't identified some of the causes of our behavior is because there are none. Because our behavior, some fraction of our behavior is miraculously self-caused. That's what's driving the difference between identical twins. There's just one problem. Turkheimer explicitly rejects the supernatural worldview and rejects the view that our unexplained behavior is uncaused, as we see here. In Genetics and Human Agency, right after he introduces the idea that the non-shared environment is free will, he states, not the kind of metaphysical free will that no one believes in anymore, according to which human souls float free above the mechanistic constraints of the physical world. And in that Turkheimer and Waldron review we talked about before, he concedes that something about the environment must be causing differences among genetically related siblings reared together. So how do we square this circle? I put it to you that we cannot. In the free will debate, we can only coherently hold two of the following three positions simultaneously. A, that human agency and personal responsibility exist. B, that all human behavior has antecedent causes. And C, that human agency is incompatible with the antecedent causation of behavior. Compatibilism holds that A and B are true. Hard incompatibilism holds that B and C are true. And libertarian incompatibilism holds that A and C are true. By trying to support all three propositions at the same time, Turkheimer places himself in an impossible bind. He wants to support a libertarian incompatibilist view, but he also wants to support a secular materialist worldview in which all human behavior, like all other natural phenomena, has antecedent secular causes. This drives us to support an untenable position, the position that antecedent causes of behavior only infringe upon our free will to the extent that we know about them, the kind of see no evil theory of free will described by Stephen Morse and summarily dismissed by the legal philosopher Michael Moore here. Again, Turkheimer is not alone in reaching this view. As I've tried to highlight at the very beginning, this is an extremely common view in the social and behavioral sciences. Turkheimer has just gone further in thinking this through and made it into an explicit theory of free will. I think this is a valiant attempt by Turkheimer to try and defend human agency and the perceived encroachments of genetic and environmental causation. But for secular materialists, the best way to do that is via compatibilism, not through a selective form of incompatibilism. So the main takeaway I want to leave you with today is this. Genetic determinism is essentially a non-problem in the academic free will debate. Most non-religious philosophers agree that all human behavior has antecedent secular causes, and the question of whether we have responsibility for our behavior doesn't hinge on the question of whether those causes are genetic or environmental. We need to stop panicking over whether genetic differences on socially significant behavioral traits explain a substantial fraction of behavioral variation. And we certainly shouldn't be letting these philosophical anxieties bias our reception, bias our reception of different empirical findings. We can conduct behavioral genetic research without fear that the sky might fall. Thanks for your attention.
Yeah, I'm not in there with you, so how about it?
Great talk. I thought it was well organized and well articulated.
Thank you.
I want to suggest that we can pull apart, or that academic philosophy pulls apart terms that are kind of pushed together in this presentation. One is about free will, and one is about luck. So there are philosophers of luck that are like, I take a broadly compatibilist view that some human agency necessary for moral responsibility is compatible with living in a deterministic all of our behavior ultimately. And that within that, we still make distinctions between different types of causes, ways that are at least relevant for a moral intuition, right? So if someone has an epileptic seizure and that causes them to crash the car and run into someone versus is an alcoholic and gets drunk, we can think of both of those as caused by something that operates through the brain. But even more would agree that we treat those people different of a legal or moral response.
Absolutely, that's compatibilism.
Yeah, that's compatibilism, but it's compatibilism that even though all behavior is caused, of that doesn't mean that we're uniform or that there's no distinctions between different types of morally relevant behavior.
Absolutely. Sorry.
So that, I guess my question is, if you were like a kind of a Peter Strawson-esque, not hard incompatibilist, social naturalist about moral responsibility, do you think that something about genetics might still be informative about the distinctions that we still make in our common practices of holding each other? And we can talk about this.
Yeah, we've got very. I'll try very quickly. I mean, I think obviously genetics places limitations on what we can do, right? I think that the problem in how we think about genetic causation infringing on our agency is that we think if you have a high polygenic score, you're destined to have success in life in whatever, in a socioeconomic PGS, let's say. Or if you have a low one, you're destined for less fortunate outcomes, crudely speaking, right? But I think, we can, I don't have a genetic endowment to be really, really tall or to play basketball extremely well. And, even if I train really hard, I just don't think I could ever, from childhood, I just don't think I could achieve some elite levels that some people with a higher genetic propensity for the sport could achieve. We're talking very, abstractly here as a philosophical example, but so I think genetics places certain limitations on what we are able to do, which is therefore a limitation on our agency, but it's not bidirectional. If you can have more powers than other people, so there is some relevance. There is some relevance of genetic and environmental causation to the options available to you. But I think the way when we use statistical predictors as an index of our agency being compressed, we're effectively saying you are programmed to succeed as well as fail rather than having a ceiling on what you can do. And this is only relevant to certain kinds of traits that I can use these kind of examples, but I think that's partly how genetic and environmental predictors are still relevant. Yeah.
I guess just to follow that up, to reframe my question with the common is I think that I think I agree with you about all of this can be resolved by like how broadly we have moral responsibility. But I think that leave open the question of whether or not there are scientific results that change our social practices of holding each other accountable by virtue of changing whether or not the kind of distinctions that what's often called like exempting or exemption. Like, I think there's still really a space for scientific knowledge there, and that's separate from the metaphysical.